Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's July 4th, 2026, and while America is lighting fireworks and celebrating 250 years of independence, something massive is happening on the other side of the world that changes the entire board in the Middle East and potentially creates a new threat to the United States that most people aren't even talking about yet. Iran is burying its supreme leader. The funeral is happening now. The streets of Tehran are packed. The state media is doing what state media always does in a moment like this, which is broadcasting maximum grief theater, maximum regime messaging. But underneath all of that funeral imagery, underneath all of that ceremonial mourning, something genuinely dangerous is quietly taking shape. A succession crisis inside one of the world's most heavily armed and ideologically extreme regimes. And that, my friends, is what we're breaking down today. Because the death of a supreme leader in a country with tens of thousands of ballistic missiles, an unresolved nuclear program, a proxy army stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, and a military that has spent the last several months absorbing American precision strikes, that's not just a political transition. That's a loaded weapon sitting in an empty room with nobody's hand on the grip. Stick around, because we're going to break down the exact threat that emerges from this moment, what the U.S. military's posture needs to look like in the next 72 hours, and then stay about 3/4 of the way through for the global roundup section, because there's a development out of Eastern Europe that ties directly into this moment in a way that should concern everyone. And then we'll close with the 4D chess strategic analysis section, my friends, because this is genuinely one of the most complex and dangerous inflection points we've covered on this channel. So let's start with what we actually know. The Supreme Leader is gone. Now, if you've been following this channel through the entire arc of Operation Epic Fury, Operation Midnight Hammer, the naval blockade, the bunker buster strikes at Isfahan, all of it, you already know that the regime has been under extraordinary military and economic pressure for months. The IRGC's ballistic missile stockpile has been dramatically degraded. Their air defense network has been systematically rolled back by F-16 Wild Weasels carrying AGM-88 HARM missiles and by EA-18G Growlers doing electronic suppression runs. Their fast attack craft, their so-called Mosquito fleet, has been swatted out of the Strait of Hormuz engagement by engagement. Their ability to see, to communicate, and to coordinate across their coastal radar network has been methodically dismantled, strike by strike. And through all of that, the regime refused to sign a deal. They stalled with the Qatari diplomats. They said yes in private and no in public. They kept the world waiting on a signature that never came. And now, in the middle of all of that ongoing pressure, the man who sat at the top of that entire power structure is dead. So the question everybody watching this right now needs to ask themselves is, what does a cornered, fractured, heavily degraded regime do when the single figure who held its internal power balanced together suddenly isn't there anymore? Because the answer to that question is the thing that determines what the next several weeks look like, not just for the Middle East, but potentially for the United States. Because here's the threat that emerges from this moment, and I want to be very direct about this because I don't think the mainstream analysis is being honest enough about it. The danger isn't that Iran suddenly becomes more powerful. Their military capability has been dramatically reduced. That's documented, that's confirmed by CENTCOM, that's visible in the open source tracking of what's left of their Navy and their Air Force. The danger is the opposite. The danger is a regime that's been weakened to the point of desperation, is now also leaderless, and the faction that's most likely to fill that vacuum quickly is the faction that's always been the most extreme, the most willing to absorb pain, and the most ideologically committed to escalation as a survival strategy. We're talking about the IRGC hardliner faction, and a hardline IRGC faction that suddenly finds itself holding the most guns in a power vacuum, inside a regime that still has proxy armies across the region, that still has whatever enriched nuclear material survive the bunker buster strikes, and that has every reason to prove its strength at exactly the moment when its strength is most in question. That's the combination that should have every analyst, every Pentagon planner, and frankly, everyone watching this video paying very close attention to the next 72 hours. Let me break down the specific threat vectors, because I think this is where we need to get into the actual detail. There are 3 that I'm tracking right now. The first threat vector is proxy escalation, and it's the most likely immediate move. The IRGC, in a succession crisis, is going to want to demonstrate that the resistance axis is still functional, still capable, still feared. The way you do that when you can't directly engage the United States Air Force without losing more of your own infrastructure is you reach for your proxies. So I think you watch Lebanon very carefully right now. Hezbollah has been put on notice by Israel that they're not covered under any peace deal umbrella, and they've been absorbing their own pressure, but they still have significant rocket and missile capability. Watch the Houthi movement in Yemen. The Red Sea corridor, the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, which we've talked about on this channel before, that's their second maritime choke point. And a newly emboldened or newly desperate IRGC faction looking to prove relevance could absolutely try to turn that back on. And watch the Iranian-backed militia networks in Iraq, because those guys have been relatively quiet during the negotiations, but quiet doesn't mean gone. And a succession vacuum in Tehran is exactly the kind of moment where local commanders who've been sitting on orders start looking for permission they don't actually need to escalate. So the first threat vector is a proxy surge across multiple theaters simultaneously, designed not to win a military engagement, but to demonstrate that the resistance axis is still alive, and the new power in Tehran can still reach out and touch you. That's a very dangerous demonstration if it goes to places it hasn't gone before. The second threat vector is the nuclear question, and I want to be very careful here because I think this is where the most serious long-term risk sits. We know from Operation Midnight Hammer that the underground enrichment facilities near Isfahan and other sites were struck with GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. Those are 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs dropped from B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, designed specifically to penetrate deep, reinforced concrete and detonate underground. Those strikes were devastating. The facilities were seriously degraded. But we also know from public statements and from the ongoing negotiation framework that not all of Iran's enriched material was accounted for and destroyed in those strikes. The deal that the Qataris were trying to get signed specifically included language about the U.S. taking physical custody of surviving enriched uranium stockpiles. That deal was never signed. So right now, today, as Iran buries its supreme leader and a succession fight begins inside the most powerful and most extreme factions of the regime, there is still enriched nuclear material somewhere in Iran that has not been accounted for and has not been surrendered. And the people who know where it is are the IRGC hardliners, the same people most likely to come out of this succession vacuum with the most power. So the nuclear question doesn't go away when the supreme leader dies. It actually becomes more urgent and more dangerous, because now you have unclear command and control over nuclear material inside a regime going through a chaotic transition. That's the kind of scenario that keeps everyone in the E-ring of the Pentagon awake all night, and it should. The third threat vector is something I want to call regime volatility risk, and it's the one that's hardest to plan against because it's the most unpredictable. When a heavily authoritarian regime loses the central figure who's been the final arbiter of internal disputes, the factions that were previously held in check by that central authority start looking at each other and doing math. Who has the most guns? Who controls the most revenue? Who can assemble the fastest coalition of loyalists? And in that calculation, aggressive external action has historically served as a tool for consolidating internal power, because nothing unifies a fractured revolutionary movement faster than an external enemy and a demonstration of defiance. So the risk I'm flagging here is that the faction that wins the succession fight might actually try to manufacture an escalation with the United States, specifically to consolidate power domestically. Not because they think they can beat the US military. We've already established fairly definitively that they cannot. But because the narrative of resistance is what holds their coalition together, and a new supreme leader who wants to be seen as the legitimate heir to that resistance tradition has every political incentive to do something dramatic early in their tenure, even if that something dramatic gets another 100 IRGC facilities blown up, because the narrative value domestically outweighs the military cost. That's the regime volatility risk. And it's the one I think the US military is most actively planning around in the next 72 hours. So what does the military posture need to look like right now? Because this is where I want to give you my actual fighter pilot read on what I'd want to see if I were still in that world. Number one, no drawdown. Whatever assets are currently positioned in theater, F-16s, F-15Es, carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, the destroyer network holding the southern corridor in the Strait of Hormuz, the EAGLS counter-drone systems, the Apache helicopter units doing the closed drone hunting work, all of that stays exactly where it is. You do not reduce your presence during a succession crisis in a regime with this profile. That's the single fastest way to send a signal that you're backing off. And backing off during a power vacuum gets filled by whoever is most aggressive. Number two, you lean very hard on intelligence assets right now because the thing that matters most in a succession crisis is knowing which faction is winning and knowing that fast. If the westward-facing diplomatic wing somehow manages to consolidate power in this vacuum, the off-ramp possibility stays alive, and you want to know that, so you can be ready to step through it. If the IRGC hardliner faction wins the succession fight, you want to know that as fast as possible, because that changes the target set, changes the negotiating framework, and changes the threat assessment for the proxy networks across the region. Number three, you keep the Qatari channel open even though it's just had a funeral walk through it. Because whatever leadership emerges from this succession crisis is going to need to establish its own relationship with the outside world. And keeping diplomatic infrastructure alive through the transition means the off-ramp is still there if the new power decides they want to take it. You don't close that door just because the person you were negotiating with is no longer in the picture. Now, let me talk about the weapons and the platforms that are relevant to this specific moment, because I think it helps to understand what the military actually has available and postured if this goes kinetic again. The F-16 Block 50 and Block 52 Wild Weasels have been the workhorses of the radar suppression mission this entire war. They carry the AGM-88 HARM missile, the one that homes directly on radar emissions, and they've been systematically rolling back Iran's reconstituted air defense network every time it tries to come back online. Those jets are still in theater, and their relevance actually increases during a succession crisis, because a new regime faction trying to prove its strength might try to turn Iran's remaining air defense radars back on aggressively, which is exactly the situation those F-16 CJs exist to punish. You turn on your radar, a HARM missile is going to find you, and the F-16 Wild Weasel pilot who sent it on its way isn't losing a second of sleep about it. The F-15E Strike Eagles are still the primary door-kicker platform for hardened targets. That two-seat aircraft, with the weapons systems officer in the back running the targeting pod, has been carrying GBU-72 bunker busters against underground missile storage and carrying GBU-54 laser-guided bombs against coastal infrastructure throughout this conflict. If a new regime faction tries to reconstitute ballistic missile storage rapidly in the succession chaos, the Strike Eagle is the answer, and it's already in theater. The APKWS laser-guided rocket system, both on F-16s and on AH-64 Apache helicopters, has been the cost-effective answer to the Shahed drone problem throughout this war. Those things cost roughly the same as a Shahed drone, meaning every time you shoot one down, you're basically breaking even on the engagement cost, and they've been doing it effectively. That system doesn't lose its relevance during a succession crisis. It actually becomes more important, because a new regime desperate to demonstrate capability is going to throw drones at everything it can reach, and you need a system that can answer drone swarms economically. And then the naval backbone, the Arleigh-Burke-class guided missile destroyers with their Aegis combat systems, the SM-3 interceptors for ballistic missiles, the Phalanx close-in weapon systems for drones and fast attack craft, all of that is still anchoring the southern corridor and keeping the commercial shipping lanes open. That naval presence is the single most important signal of intent during a succession crisis, because it says very clearly, regardless of who ends up in charge in Tehran, the Strait of Hormuz is not closing. And I want to spend another minute on one capability that I think becomes uniquely important during a succession crisis, and that's the B-2 Spirit. Because we know from Operation Midnight Hammer that the B-2 was the platform that delivered the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator against the deeply buried nuclear sites. That thing flies from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. It's stealthy. It can reach anywhere on Earth with aerial refueling. And it carries the only conventional weapon in the U.S. inventory that can defeat the kind of deep underground hardened facilities that Iran specifically engineered its nuclear program around. The reason I bring this up now is that in a succession crisis, if there is any ambiguity about who controls the remaining nuclear material, if there's any signal that a hardline faction is trying to move or reconstitute enriched uranium under the cover of the political chaos, that's exactly the scenario where the B-2 becomes relevant again. I'm not predicting that, I want to be clear. But the whole strategic logic of keeping that capability in the fight is so that the cost of any regime faction trying to make a nuclear play during a vulnerable transition period is immediately and catastrophically clear. That's deterrence, and it's the kind of deterrence that actually works on military planners inside Iran who understand exactly what those aircraft can do, because they've already felt it once. There's also the intelligence collection piece that I think deserves a dedicated minute, because this is honestly the most important military capability in the next 72 to 96 hours, more important than any strike platform. The RQ-4 Global Hawk at altitude, the MQ-9 Reaper variants doing lower altitude persistent surveillance, the RC-135 Rivet Joint doing signals intelligence collection, to listen to what the different IRGC factions are actually saying to each other on their communications networks. These are the assets that tell the Pentagon which scenario we're in. And the reason that matters so much right now is that the correct U.S. military response to Scenario 1, a hardliner consolidation, looks completely different from the correct response to Scenario 2, a pragmatic succession opening, which looks completely different from the correct response to Scenario 3, a genuine fragmentation of command authority. Getting the intelligence read right in the first week of this succession determines what the next 3 months look like. So while everyone is watching the funeral coverage and the political theater, the most important work happening right now is being done by people you'll never see on camera, in signals intelligence centers and imagery analysis teams, piecing together the real picture of what's happening inside the Iranian power structure. Now, I want to talk about something that I think gets missed in all of this coverage, and it's the economic timing question. Because here's the thing, Iran's economy has been in free fall for months. Sanctions, the blockade, the revenue hit from losing control of Strait tolls, the frozen assets that were supposed to be released if they signed the deal but weren't because they didn't sign the deal, all of that has been accumulating. Ordinary Iranians have been living through this. And now they're going to watch a succession process that is entirely internal to the regime, entirely dominated by the IRGC and the clerical establishment, with zero input from the 70 or 80 million people who actually have to live under whatever government emerges. That combination, economic collapse plus a closed political succession, is exactly the recipe for the kind of internal unrest that has historically been one of the few things that actually moves authoritarian regimes in unexpected directions. So I'm not predicting a revolution here. I want to be clear about that because I've seen a lot of bad analysis over the years that keeps predicting an imminent Iranian revolution based on wishful thinking rather than actual ground truth. But I am saying that the succession period is when internal pressure has the highest chance of expressing itself in ways the regime can't fully control. And that adds another variable to an already extremely volatile situation that the Pentagon is going to have to account for in its planning. All right, let's get to the global roundup section because I promised you a development out of Eastern Europe that ties directly into this moment, and I don't want to bury the lead on this. Reports over the last 48 hours indicate that Russian military intelligence assets have been significantly more active in their monitoring of the situation in Iran, specifically their signals intelligence collection targeting the Iranian succession communications. Now, why does that matter? Because Russia and Iran have had an extremely transactional relationship throughout this entire conflict. Russia has been a customer for Iranian drones, the Shahed family of one-way attack weapons that they've been using in Ukraine. Russia has been a quiet diplomatic backer of Iranian positions in multilateral forums. And Russia absolutely does not want to see a stable US-aligned or even US-neutral Iran emerge from the succession crisis. Because a normalized Iran that's signed a deal, opened its strait, and rejoined the international economic system is an Iran that no longer needs Russia and no longer serves as a useful counterpressure to American influence in the region. So if you're wondering whether the Kremlin is going to try to play a role in the Iranian succession, even a quiet behind-the-scenes role, the answer is almost certainly yes. And that means the US intelligence picture in the next several weeks isn't just about tracking IRGC faction movements inside Iran. It's about tracking whether Russian influence is actively shaping which faction wins that succession fight. Because a Russian-backed hardliner faction winning the Iranian succession is a very different threat picture than a succession that plays out entirely on internal Iranian dynamics. Keep your eyes on that storyline, because I think it's going to develop fast. Also in the global roundup, Ukraine's continued long-range drone campaign against Russian energy and military infrastructure has now been running for over 6 weeks at high operational tempo. Russia has claimed interceptions of hundreds of drones per night on some of those operations, and while you always discount Russian military claims significantly, the sheer scale of the Ukrainian campaign is clearly straining Russian air defense resources and manpower. And here's the indirect connection to the Iran story, because part of Russia's air defense component has historically relied on Iranian drone intelligence sharing and coordination. As that relationship gets more complicated by the Iranian succession crisis, watch for whether Russia's own drone and counter-drone posture starts to show any gaps. That brings us to the 4D chess strategic analysis section, my friends. And I want to give you my honest read on what I think the next 30 days actually looks like, coming out of this succession moment. The most dangerous immediate window is the next 5 to 10 days, before any new leadership figure has been publicly confirmed, and before the internal IRGC faction alignment has stabilized. In that window, the risk of an unauthorized or semi-authorized escalation from a local IRGC commander or a proxy network looking to demonstrate loyalty to whichever faction they're betting on is genuinely elevated. That's the period where I'd want maximum ISR, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, maximum naval presence, and maximum communication discipline from the US military. Don't escalate, don't de-escalate, make sure every asset is exactly where it needs to be, and watch for the first signal of which faction is actually winning the internal race. After that initial window, I think you get one of 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, a successor emerges who's nominally from the clerical establishment, but is functionally controlled by the IRGC hardliner faction, and the regime doubles down on the resistance narrative, meaning more proxy activity, more drone harassment, potentially an attempt to reclose the strait, and an extended military campaign that goes through the summer. That's the scenario that requires the most sustained US military commitment and the most willingness from the administration to keep the retrenchment strike cycle going indefinitely until the economic and military cost to the hardliners becomes truly unbearable. Scenario 2, and this is the one I think is underrated, a successor or a council emerges that's genuinely more pragmatic. Not because they've had a change of heart about the US, but because they've done the math And they understand that the regime's survival probability goes up dramatically if they sign the deal and goes down to near zero if they keep refusing. In this scenario, the off-ramp that's been sitting on the table for weeks actually gets taken, the Qatari channel reopens quickly, and you see movement towards signature within 2 to 3 weeks of the succession being resolved. I think this scenario is more possible than most analysts are giving it credit for, specifically because the economic situation inside Iran is genuinely severe, and a new leadership figure who inherits a collapsing economy without the military assets to protect the fiefdom has a much stronger incentive to make a deal than a leadership figure who feels militarily capable of stalling indefinitely. Scenario 3 is the wild card and the most dangerous. A full internal fracture where no single faction is able to consolidate power quickly, creating a period of genuine instability inside the Iranian state apparatus where nobody has clear authority over the military assets, the nuclear material, or the proxy networks. In that scenario, the U.S. military's job becomes less about applying pressure and more about very carefully watching for any sign that command and control over the dangerous stuff has broken down, because that's when the risk of an accidental escalation or an unauthorized action by a rogue commander goes through the roof. That scenario requires the most careful intelligence work and the most disciplined operational restraint from the U.S. military, because the worst thing you can do in a genuine power vacuum is apply military pressure in a way that inadvertently strengthens the most extreme faction's consolidation bid. One more thing I want to address in this section, because I've seen it in the comments consistently over the last several weeks, and I think the succession moment makes it more relevant than ever. People keep asking whether the administration has any actual leverage to shape who emerges from this succession. And I think the honest answer is yes, but it's indirect leverage and it needs to be applied very carefully. The leverage isn't military, it's economic. Whoever emerges as the next supreme leader or the next dominant faction in Tehran is going to inherit a country that is economically on its knees. The frozen asset releases, the sanctions waivers, the oil export normalization, all of that is still sitting on the table as part of the deal framework that was never signed. And a new leadership figure who wants to demonstrate competence to an Iranian population that's been suffering under economic collapse has a very clear path to looking like a winner without ever having to publicly capitulate to the United States. Sign the deal, take the economic relief, open the strait, let the money flow. Tell your domestic audience that the nuclear material handover was a strategic masterstroke that saved the country from further destruction. That's a narrative a smart successor could absolutely sell internally, because the Iranian public at this point mostly wants the lights to stay on and the currency to stop collapsing. So the economic leverage is real, and I think whoever ends up running U.S.-Iran policy in the next few weeks needs to keep that front and center rather than immediately defaulting back to the military pressure track. Military pressure doesn't go away, it stays fully intact as the backstop. But the economic offer needs to be clearly communicated to whatever new leadership is forming in Tehran right now, because the window where a new leader might actually want to take it is exactly this early period before they've fully committed to one factional identity or another. So what's my overall read? I think Iran's succession crisis creates more danger in the short term and potentially more opportunity in the medium term than most people are pricing in right now. The short-term danger is real, it's proxied, it's connected to nuclear material that hasn't been fully accounted for, and it's complicated by Russian interference in the succession dynamics. But the medium-term opportunity is also real, because a new regime that inherited a defeated military, a collapsed economy, and a population that has watched tens of thousands of its own people be killed by their government over years of protest, that regime has reasons to take the off-ramp that the previous leadership simply refused to acknowledge. Whether they're wise enough to take it is another question entirely. But the off-ramp is still there. America lights its fireworks tonight on the 250th. Whatever happens next in Tehran, the men and women flying those F-16s over the Strait of Hormuz, crewing those destroyers holding the southern corridor, running the intelligence collection that's going to tell us which way the succession goes, they're doing the hard work that makes those fireworks possible. Don't forget that. What do you think happens from here? Do you think this succession crisis creates the opening for a deal that the regime refused to sign before? Or do you think the hardliners consolidate, double down, and we're headed into another round of escalation? Let me know in the comments below. Love hearing your thoughts on this. Go ahead and follow me on X and Instagram, posting there pretty much every day as this develops. And don't forget, you can grab a signed or unsigned copy of my book, The Art of Modern War, over at Mabook. Calm, because every strategic principle we've talked about today, knowing your enemy, knowing yourself, understanding the difference between a regime's interests and a nation's interests, those are things you can apply in your own life too. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Really appreciate you. Every one of you who shows up for these videos, who asks the hard questions in the comments, who shares this with people who need to understand what's actually happening in the world, You're the reason we keep doing this. Stay informed, stay sharp, and stay in the fight. I'll see you in the next video. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off. I could see like an Iranian state television breaking news bulletin right about now. They're like, good evening and welcome to Islamic Republic Broadcasting, where all of our news is pre-approved for maximum regime loyalty and minimum factual content. We interrupt your regularly scheduled morning broadcast to bring you a very important announcement. The Supreme Leader has been called to be with God, which is extremely convenient timing and definitely has nothing to do with the F-15E that may or may not have visited the neighborhood recently. In related news, several senior IRGC commanders are currently engaged in what we are describing as vigorous policy discussions, which is not a succession fight at all. It's just a very spirited agreement between men who all definitely have the same vision for the future of the Islamic Republic. We would like to assure the world that the Islamic Republic remains strong, unified, and in complete control of all its military assets, some of which we can still find. We would also like to clarify that the rumors about certain IRGC factions texting each other, wait, so who's in charge now, are completely false and are propaganda spread by the American regime. Please stand by for 17 consecutive hours of funeral coverage featuring our most committed professional grievers. Thank you for watching. And remember, the Strait of Hormuz is definitely still closed except for the hundreds of ships going through it.